It was early August in 2019, one of those hot, sticky nights when the air clings to your skin even after the sun goes down. I was 21, living at my parents' house in upstate New York while they were away visiting my grandmother in Florida. They'd invited me to come along, but I had to work, so I stayed behind. At first, I relished the quiet, the house all to myself, no one to nag me about leaving dishes in the sink or staying up too late. But by the second night, the novelty had worn off. The house was a colonial-style two-story, with tall windows that overlooked a dense stretch of woods in the backyard. Growing up, my mom always joked about how the woods felt alive. And while it was meant to be lighthearted, the idea always unsettled me. At night, the trees cast long, spindly shadows that crept across the backyard, making it hard not to glance over my shoulder whenever I went outside. The first strange thing happened on the third night. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone while a rerun of some sitcom played in the background. It was past midnight, and the neighborhood was dead silent. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the window behind me. At first, I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind, even though there wasn't a breeze that night. I ignored it, but the tapping continued, growing more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, I turned around. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something on the other side of the glass, something tall and motionless. My heart raced as I approached the window. I debated pulling back the curtain but decided against it, suddenly afraid of what I might see. Instead, I flicked on the porch light, hoping to scare off whatever, or whoever, was out there. The tapping stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. Finally, I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or a bird and went to bed, though I didn't sleep much. The next day, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was an old house, prone to creaks and groans, and I was letting my imagination run wild. I spent the afternoon running errands and didn't get home until after dark. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights swept across the house, and I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. I froze, my hand hovering over the gear shift. The house was supposed to be empty. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but the uneasy feeling lingered as I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked before settling in for the night. Around 11 p.m., I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, and it wasn't coming from the living room window. It was coming from the sliding glass door in the dining room, which faced the backyard. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find and crept toward the door. The curtains were open just a crack, enough to see the dark expanse of the backyard. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the porch, barely illuminated by the moonlight. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its head was tilted at an odd angle, as though it was trying to peer into the house. "Who's there?" I shouted, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure didn't move. It stood there for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak and rustle set my nerves on edge, and I kept the knife within arm's reach the entire time. The next morning, I called my parents and told them what had happened. My dad suggested I call the police, but I felt foolish explaining the situation. There was someone in the backyard, but I don't know who or why. No, I didn't see their face. Yes, they just stood there. What could they even do with that information? By the fourth night, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, and all the lights on, hoping to deter whoever, or whatever, had been lurking outside. Around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off on the couch, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. But as I sat up and strained to listen, it became clearer, a low, rasping whisper, coming from the window nearest to me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was talking to me. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The whispering stopped immediately. My heart pounded as I stood there, waiting for some sign of movement. Then, just as I was about to step back, something slammed against the glass, hard enough to rattle the frame. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping my phone in the process. When I looked up, the window was empty, but the curtain had been pushed aside as though someone, or something, had been peering in. I called the police. This time, I wasn't taking any chances. When they arrived, I explained everything as best I could. They searched the property and found footprints in the backyard. Large, bare footprints that led from the woods to the sliding glass door, then to the window, before disappearing back into the trees. The officers told me to stay somewhere else for the night, but I refused. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let some stranger scare me away. They promised to send a patrol car to drive by periodically, but I didn't feel reassured. That night, I barricaded myself in the upstairs bedroom, shoving a dresser in front of the door and keeping the knife within arm's reach. I didn't think I'd sleep, but exhaustion got the better of me, and I eventually drifted off. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom window sliding open. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but when I turned toward the window, I saw a hand, pale and bony, gripping the frame. Before I could react, the figure from the backyard climbed inside, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood there, towering over me, its face hidden in shadow. I screamed, grabbing the knife and slashing wildly. The figure recoiled, making an inhuman, guttural noise before retreating back out the window. I ran to the door, shoving the dresser aside and bolting downstairs. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was long gone, leaving only a trail of blood smeared across the windowsill. I stayed with a friend for the rest of the week. When my parents returned, they installed security cameras and motion-activated lights around the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside my window that night. The cameras never captured anything, and the police never found the person responsible. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. The faint sound of tapping, followed by a whisper that sends chills down my spine. It was the winter of 2017, during the week leading up to Christmas, and I was house-sitting for my uncle while he and his family vacationed in Vermont. Their home was a charming old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods on all sides. I was 25, used to living in cities, so the isolation made me a little uneasy, but I figured it would be a quiet week. I was wrong. The first 2 days were uneventful. The snowstorm that rolled in on the second night blanketed everything, making the world outside the farmhouse eerily silent. I spent most of my time curled up in the living room, working on my laptop while the fireplace crackled. The house had its quirks. The floorboards creaked loudly whenever I walked, and the heating system made strange clunking noises in the night, but I chalked it up to the age of the place. It was on the third night that things took a turn. I had just finished a late dinner and decided to do some laundry in the basement before heading to bed. The basement was an unfinished, cold space with concrete floors and walls lined with wooden shelves stacked with old boxes and tools. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows. As I was tossing clothes into the washing machine, I heard something faint but distinct, a soft shuffling noise, like footsteps. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the basement, near the shelves. I froze, listening intently. The shuffling stopped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I told myself it was probably a mouse or the wind rattling something loose, though I didn't entirely believe it. I finished loading the washer quickly and hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. It was an old house, after all, and old houses make noise. Still, before I went to bed, I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint thumping. At first, I thought it was the storm outside, but as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from inside the house, from the basement. It was a steady, rhythmic thudding, as if someone were knocking on the concrete floor. My heart raced as I listened, trying to make sense of it. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My uncle didn't have great cell service at his place, but I knew I could still call 911 if I needed to. I tiptoed out of the bedroom and into the hallway, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The sound was louder now, echoing up the staircase that led to the basement. As I approached the door, the thudding stopped. I hesitated, unsure if I should open it. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't heard anything and go back to bed, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and slowly opened it, shining my flashlight down the staircase. "Is someone down there?" I called, my voice trembling. Silence. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything, and just as I was about to close the door, I heard it again. Soft shuffling, like feet dragging across the concrete. This time, it was closer. Much closer. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure, crouched low near the bottom of the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light. But when I blinked, it was gone. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I ran back to my bedroom and locked that door too, then sat on the bed clutching my phone. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I heard noises in the basement of an old farmhouse? They'd probably dismiss it as a raccoon or some other animal. I stayed awake for hours, listening for any more sounds. But the house remained silent, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I decided to check the basement in daylight. Armed with a kitchen knife and my phone, I cautiously unlocked the door and made my way down the stairs. The basement looked exactly as it had the night before. Boxes and tools on the shelves, the washer and dryer humming softly in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed something on the floor near the shelves. Footprints. Bare, human footprints, leading from the far corner of the basement to the bottom of the stairs. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't mine. I'd been wearing socks the night before. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I ran upstairs, locked the basement door, and called my uncle. He was skeptical but told me to call the police if it happened again. I decided to stay up all night, keeping the lights on and the TV playing softly in the background. That night, around 3 a.m., the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just thudding. It was scratching, like nails dragging against the basement door. My heart pounded as I sat frozen on the couch, clutching the kitchen knife. The scratching stopped, but then I heard something far worse. The sound of the basement door handle turning, slowly and deliberately. I bolted for the front door, flinging it open and running out into the snow in my pajamas. I didn't stop until I reached my car, where I locked the doors and called 911. The dispatcher tried to calm me down as I explained what had happened. When the police arrived, they searched the house and found the basement door unlocked. But there was no sign of anyone, and the footprints from the day before were gone. They chalked it up to my imagination or stress, but I knew better. I left the house that night and stayed with a friend until my uncle returned from his trip. When I told him what had happened, he laughed it off, saying the house had always been a little creepy. But a few weeks later, he called me, his tone serious. He'd been in the basement cleaning when he found something tucked behind the shelves, a tattered sleeping bag and a collection of empty food wrappers. Someone had been living down there. To this day, I can't explain how they got in, or why they stayed so long without me noticing. But every time I think about the night I heard the doorknob turn, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the autumn air was crisp and quiet. I was 29, living in a modest two-story duplex in rural Illinois. My neighbors shared the other half of the house, but were out of town that weekend. It felt a little eerie knowing I was the only one around, but I convinced myself I was too old to be scared of being alone. After finishing dinner, I decided to relax in the living room with some Netflix. The house had an odd layout. My living room faced the staircase, and from where I sat on the couch, I could see the top of the stairs and the dark hallway that led to the bedrooms. It was the kind of view that kept drawing your eyes, even when you didn't want it to. The night started uneventfully. I watched 2 episodes of a crime drama before brushing my teeth and heading upstairs. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, right next to a storage room we rarely used. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, a habit I'd picked up after living in the city for years. I fell asleep around midnight, only to be jolted awake by a faint sound. It was coming from somewhere upstairs, a rhythmic creaking noise, like someone walking slowly across the floorboards. At first, I thought it might be the old house settling, but as I lay there, the sound became more distinct, deliberate. It wasn't the kind of noise you could brush off. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. My heart was pounding as I crept toward the door. I pressed my ear to it and held my breath, straining to hear. The creaking had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, I heard something that made my stomach drop, a faint whisper, coming from the other side of the door. It was a single word, "Hello?" I froze, my hand hovering over the lock. My first thought was to call the police, but the rational part of my brain insisted it was probably nothing. A prank, maybe, or the neighbors playing tricks before leaving town. I decided to check the hallway. When I unlocked the door and peeked out, the hallway was empty. The air felt colder than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shone my flashlight toward the far end of the hall, illuminating the door to the storage room. It was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier in the week. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I walked toward the door, trying to convince myself that the wind or a draft must have opened it. As I approached, the creaking sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the storage room, it was coming from the stairs. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, silhouetted against the dim light from the living room below. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its face obscured by shadows. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me, then began to take a step forward. I bolted back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone on the floor. I heard the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching, the creaking growing louder with each step. The doorknob rattled, followed by a soft knock. Then came the whisper again, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. "Let me in." Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I managed to explain the situation through choked breaths. She told me to stay where I was and that officers were on their way. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought the figure might have left, but then I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wood. It was moving away from the door, toward the window. I turned to face it just in time to see a pale hand press against the glass, followed by a face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring straight at me. I screamed and dove into the closet, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The face disappeared, but I could hear the rattling of the window pane as it tried to pry it open. The sound of sirens in the distance was the only thing that saved me. As they grew louder, the rattling stopped, and the house fell silent once more. I stayed hidden until the officers arrived and called out to me. When I finally stepped out, they searched the house but found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. The windows and doors were all locked. It was as if nothing had happened, yet I knew what I saw. The officers stayed with me for a while, assuring me that I was safe. But that night, as I lay in bed with the lights on, I couldn't stop staring at the window, half expecting to see that face again. I never figured out who or what it was. To this day, I can't stay home alone without feeling like I'm being watched.